All right, guys, we are going to move right into our program for this evening. Tonight is the very last Mogul Mastermind for the year. Sad, but a happy adieu to 2020. We're ready for 2021. With that being said, let's introduce Mogul. So Mogul is a real estate group focused on investors. That means that all the partners and realtors that are part of the Mogul Realty Group are also investors themselves. Mogul Mastermind is the community behind Mogul Realty Group. It's an opportunity for each of you to connect with each other, to get to know other investors, and to get the questions that you need answered. Use this as I see you laughing at my mumble jumble in the corner, which is totally fair.
You're doing great.
Why, thank you, Hugh. I appreciate it. I needed a little pep talk there for a moment.
Of course. Moral support. Let's go.
Thank you. Housekeeping tips for the evening, guys. Okay, so my recommendation, we all get Zoom fatigue. It's exhausting. The best thing you can do to try and stay engaged in Mogul Mastermind, and this is a meeting and this is a community, is to leave your camera on. If you aren't comfortable with that, that's totally fine as well, but it really helps you stay engaged and it feels like you're connecting face-to-face, something that we all need right now. Mute yourself when you're not talking, especially when we're in the main room, because we can hear you, and you know, maybe you want to be muted. The last point is to sign up for the January meeting. You'll be able to do that there'll be a link that Jen from the Mogul Realty Group will be sharing in the chat box throughout the evening. So keep tabs on that. We'll share that information as well at the end of the evening too. All right, moving into our first session. Now, 2020 has been a confusing year. Like I said, unprecedented was, I swear, the word of the year. I'm sure there will be babies named unprecedented at the end of 2020. And so we're going to look at the different markets and how they've been affected. We're going to have a panel conversation moderated by James Knull, who I always call our fearless leader. And he will host Adrian from the Edmonton Mogul team, Eric Huns from Vancouver, and Ming Lim from the Toronto team to talk about the different markets and what's going on. All right, with that being said, welcome James and our panel.
I'm muted. Oh, big applause from Hugh. What's up, buddy? And Dream. You guys, stop it. No, don't stop it. All right, so yeah, before we get into the panel, I'm just going to introduce, I'm James. We're the Mogul team. Thank you for that delightful introduction, Rebecca. We have two teams. We service Edmonton. We service Vancouver. This is just our website. Not bad, right? Check out how we seamlessly tethered the skylines together. That's a big shout out to the marketing crew for that one. Anyway, so what we thought we were going to do, normally I give a market update as the start to the meeting, and I prattle on about what's happening currently right now. But the beautiful thing about a 2020 meeting at the end of the year is that we got a recap. So we have three major markets that I think are worth talking about. Market number one is Vancouver. Obviously, we do business there. We have strong ties there. And Rebecca had mentioned that Eric, who is the team lead for the Vancouver team, is on the panel. Eric actually, sadly, woefully can't make it. So one of our top realtors from Vancouver, one of our most data-oriented guys, Kevin, is going to be stepping in on the panel, and he's going to be talking about the stats that matter. Now, from Edmonton, we have our top dog, the Rookie of the Year in 2017, the Realtor of the Year in 2018. He won another award in 2019. He won Rookie of the Year in 2018 and Realtor of the Year in 2019. Anyways, Adrian's stacking up hardware, and it's well-deserved because he's an awesome realtor. He's the Edmonton team lead. He's going to be talking Edmonton happenings. And as a very special guest, one of our friends, colleagues, referral partners, and a generally all-around super awesomely amazing guy, Ming Lim, who hosts the Volition group, which is a meetup similar to Mogul Mastermind in the Toronto market. And they have the Volition Property Group, which is a team of realtors. Now, we don't do business in Toronto. It's too far away. I don't like the plane ride. So we have to make sure that we have a strong business affiliation with the industry leaders out there. So Ming is going to be stepping in to be a part of this expert panel, giving us that Toronto GTA perspective. Super excited about it. And I'm just going to moderate. So I've got the easy job. I just get to ask the questions and steer the conversation. And if any one of you guys, you know who I'm talking about, starts rambling on, I'll just rein it in. So we're going to be talking 2020, and this is going to be a very cool opportunity to compare and contrast the three major marketplaces that we find investors pay the most attention to in Canada. Greater Vancouver area, Greater Edmonton area, Greater Toronto area. We're going to tell three stories of three cities, and we're going to see just what this year looked like, and then we'll get a little preview of what we can look for in 2021. So, fellas, why don't I hand it over to you to introduce yourself? So we'll go in reverse order because I can see in my speaker view, Ming is taking up the screen in my speaker view right now. So, Ming, why don't you say hello to the people and give us a quick intro?
Hey guys, my name is Ming Lim. I'm with Volition Properties. I'm one of the partners there. Basically, we try to be like James, but for Toronto. So we teach about investing. We help people actually buy the investment properties, and then we do construction to create those investment properties. We've been doing this. I've been doing it personally since 2001, and as a company, we've been doing it for about 6 years now.
Awesome. Yeah, it's, you guys have had one heck of a career so far, and it's been awesome. Just like sharing tales across the prairies in the Canadian Shield when we catch up and just talk strategy. So super excited about it. Adrian, tell us about you. I tried to hype you up as much as I can, but I know there's so much more.
Well, I appreciate it, James, and it's hard to live up to an introduction like that, but I appreciate it. So my name is Adrian. I'm with the Mogul team, partner with Mogul, and been on the team for quite some time. I'm an active real estate investor myself. Been investing for about 6-7 years now. Time flies when you're having fun. We were talking a little bit about some wins and funny tenant stories in our panel group, so it was good to share those tales of the trenches. So I've been an investor for 7 years, anywhere from townhouses, short-term rentals to multifamily, and that's me.
Giddy up, yeah. Big shout out to Adrian for closing on his first commercial multifamily property this year. So this guy, give him a little hand, use the clap emoticon. He's gone from single-family investor to commercial real estate mogul. Last but not least, Kevin, where are you at? Let's get you to introduce to the people.
Hi everyone, my name is Kevin with the Mogul Realty Group in Vancouver. Been investing and working with investors for the last 5 years. Done a lot of projects and transitioning into development now as well.
Awesome. And to add another feather to Kevin's cap, he is, as you guys may have heard, land assembly is one of the biggest types of deals in Vancouver. And Kevin is leading and participating in a land assembly that the Mogul team is putting together in Vancouver. If you can believe it, we are wrangling 39 individual homeowners to put together well over 1.5 acres of land to create a high-rise site for the future of Vancouver. So really big accomplishment for Kevin, and really, really exciting to be a part of that with you. Okay, so the reason I took my time and pumped everybody's tires so prodigiously is because if you didn't already get the impression that these are guys that you should be listening to, well, you should. These guys are experts. They are top performing realtors, which means not only do they pay attention to the macroeconomics and look at the stats and the data of what's going on in the market, but they are every day, every week, working with clients, putting deals together, interacting with, purchasing their own properties with, and interfacing with the marketplace constantly. They live it and they breathe it. So the perspective is twofold. It's the perspective of an expert, and it's the perspective of someone who's on the front line, which is really, really valuable. So we're going to talk 2020, and I'm not going to beat around the bush. The biggest, most important thing that dictated the pace of 2020 across the board was this whole COVID situation. So that's going to be a really big flavor of the evening. Like, I mean, all things are going to go through that lens called COVID. So we're gonna compare notes on how this impacted each and every marketplace. So the first question I'm gonna ask, and okay, so wait, quick Zoom tip. To see the 4 speakers, put your view in speaker view. So go to view, speaker view. Okay, great. I just did that. That's what I did. Great. Anyways, the first question I'm going to get going with the panel is, what was the market like? And Ming, I'm going to go with you first, just because I can see you. So what was the market like in the GTA before COVID hit?
Yeah, I mean, before COVID hit, so kind of the January, February, first week of March, it looked like it was going to be one of our hottest years on record. Things didn't actually slow down too much through the holidays like they usually do, and January just started off with a bang. Bidding wars, multiple offer situations, low inventory, high demand, typical Toronto market. That's definitely how things started pre-COVID.
Nice. Okay, and let's move across to the prairies to Edmonton. Adrian, what was it like? What was our market like? What was going on in January, February, and even in that little beginning part of March right before COVID hit?
Yeah, so before COVID hit, Edmonton has been kind of the steady Eddie city. We haven't really seen the huge spikes. We haven't seen the huge lows. We've just been like trucking along, doing our even keel sort of thing. So that's kind of what it looked like things were going to be happening for Edmonton. We usually see like spikes up, spikes down, all in that like 1 to 2% either way. So nothing really dramatic. So I think for 2020, what we were predicting was just things to just keep going on their merry way and just keep going as usual.
Awesome. And Kev, what was happening in Vancouver right as we turned the corner into 2020 before COVID?
I'm going to have to hop onto Ming's bandwagon here and mirror what he said about the Toronto market. The Vancouver market had a lot of potential moving into the first quarter there. Just to put into perspective, we had a 42.4 increase in the number of sales in January 2020 than we had in January 2019. And on top of this, we had a decrease in supply by about 20.1% from January 2020 to 2019. So you can see that high demand, low supply, typical Vancouver market.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Vancouver and Toronto have very similar experiences, and then Edmonton is a bit of an interesting case in the middle. So, okay, so we're cruising along. Wheeling and dealing. We're seeing very typical market activity for the time of year in all 3 markets, and then COVID hits. So, what happened, Kevin? I'm just gonna I'm gonna bounce back and forth at first, and then start interrupting each other, guys. Bounce around. Let's get a dialogue. But at first, I just want to do like the bare bones update. So, COVID hits. I remember COVID very vividly because I was actually the day everything ended. I was supposed to go skiing, and we woke up, packed up the car, and then checked the snow report, and every mountain had closed. So that was March 15th, and then I got home on March 17th, and everything changed. That was the week. So like COVID hits, it's mid-March. Walk me through those first 2 weeks. Like what happened in the market, and then walk me through the next 45 days from there.
Ironically, I transitioned into COVID a little bit well. I was sick when I heard about it, so I was already self-isolating. I was, doing all the right things. Total keener. So what happened is that, like I talked about, the Vancouver market really was picking up. So we saw that as the market was picking up, our sales to active ratio started to increase. And to give a little bit more context, the sales to active ratio tells us for how many properties are active on the market, how many listings are selling. And so to gauge this, if the sales to active ratio is below 12% for an extended period of time, there's going to be downward pressure on prices. And if this number is above 20 for an extended period of time, there's going to be upward pressure on prices. So moving into March, when it was announced, March was actually, we won't see the effects of COVID until maybe a couple of, months later. So March, the sales to active ratio was 26.3. So there's strong upward pressure on prices, strong demand. When COVID hit, everything kind of went to pause. Everyone got freaked out. There's not a whole lot of information out there. And so all the clients that we were actively working with put on pause, understandably. I was concerned. And what ended up happening in April is, as that pause happened, our sales to active ratio went down to 11.8, which is drastic. Now, the ironic thing is, throughout that period, the prices didn't actually go down very much on average. In some of the specific market segments, like first-time home buyers, they experienced a little bit more of that sensitivity to COVID. But overall, there is actually only a 0.2% increase in prices between March and April. So things kind of coasted while everyone was on pause.
Awesome. Okay. And Adrian, I mean, I was riding shotgun with you because I was here in Edmonton when the market did its thing. But tell us the tale.
Yeah, it was an interesting time, and like James said, he was off to the, I think he was going skiing or off to the mountains to do some things. I had a motorcycle trip planned to Phoenix, and I had my bike shipped to Phoenix in Christmas time last year, and I was hoping to get on it and ride it, and then boom, borders shut down. Everything went into mayhem around that March 15th. So like any realtor, anytime that they're going on vacation, they really want to make sure that they make sure all their book of business is all wrapped up in a nice little bow and have all their clients ready to go to hand off and try to get everything done. And in March, I was working on quite a few investor deals. It was probably going to be a record-setting month for me in March. And I had a lot of condition waivers pushed off into kind of the end of March, just before I was about to leave. And as soon as things started to close down, from my perspective and from the investor's perspective, everybody took a pause. Most people who were looking to do anything were looking more for flips and buy and hold type properties. And they just said, hey, I'm really unsure what's going to happen. I have no idea. I really want to just take a second, step back, and see what's going to happen. So it was interesting because March, like from my perspective and from our teams, we were having a pretty busy March. And then as soon as they announced all the lockdowns, I think we've had, James, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure we had the record-setting non-waivers for March with how many people said, hey, I'm just going to wait and see. And I think that was the dialogue around the office, was everyone was just, let's just see what happens.
Yeah, I was there to add some metrics to it. Like, Adrian, you're being diplomatic, but like, it was a full-on collapse. I remember these numbers well because they burned into my mind in the month of infamy. We had office-wide, we had about 25, 26 pending deals on March 10th, and we're sitting around patting ourselves on the back, licking our chops for a particularly high production month. And we ended up only waiving conditions on 5 deals. We had over 20 deals non-waived that month. Yeah,
it was record level, that's for sure.
And it was every reason was COVID. And Ming, what happened in Toronto over that 45-day period?
I just heard you use a funny word we don't use here in Toronto, and that's a waiver. Because I think every Toronto deal is firm. But in the first 2 weeks of March, it was a similar thing. We were, to put into perspective, Toronto sales in the first 2 weeks of March had already exceeded the previous year's entire month sales. So March was on track to be one of the hottest months, hottest Marches on record. But the lockdown for us happened very similar time. I think it was March 15th as well. And we went from, really busy to just stopped. We have mostly investor clients as well, and they said the same thing. They just want to wait and see what happens. And I would say we probably had a good 2 to 3 weeks of just, silence. And I remember I had a very frank conversation with my business partners. I said, hey guys, we didn't know much about COVID. We didn't know what was going to happen with the economy ourselves. And we just had a frank conversation around like, hey, are we each in individual situations which are okay if our business nets zero for the rest of the year? Like that, what we were thinking that could be a possibility because we just didn't know what COVID was going to be like.
Yeah, that's intense. And I mean, I remember it was a very scary time. Everybody was in full panic mode. So we know what happened, but there was light at the end of that tunnel. I remember in Edmonton as early as May, I'm just going to cite, I remember there, like the Black Lives Matter thing happened and there were rallies across North America. And I remember it was right around the time we had a 10,000 person rally in Edmonton where I thought where people started to like tiptoe out of the black hole. And so, what did that, like, how severe was it? And what did it start? Like, what were your first indications of recovery and when did business start resuming to normal?
So for me, it was about, I just checked my calendar actually, because I wanted to see when it was that I started doing house showings again. And it was about 3 weeks and a couple of days. And the very first people were actually our experienced investors. So people who had done a lot of investing with us in the past, because they saw an opportunity, especially in the Toronto market. It was a bit of a break. People weren't actively buying. Real estate had been declared an essential service. And they were our first people back in the fray. They said, look, there's a pause in the market right now. I know maybe I'm not getting much of a price discount, but at least I'm not fighting with 15 other people for the same property. And that turned April into a record month for us because of all those people that were just buying up those properties where, other people were kind of scared of the situation.
Got it. So it was really April when people exhaled and started cranking along again.
Yeah, kind of the second week of April is really when we started seeing that.
Wow. So Adrian, what did that experience look like in Edmonton? Because I recall us being on a different timeline.
Yeah, we were definitely on a different timeline. Most people, for us, when we look at the stats, and there's two stats that I really focus on, and that would be the sales percentage year over year. So basically what happened in April of this year versus April of last year. And our stats really started to show up in April. And that's when we had about a 55% decline from April 2019 to April 2020. And then even when we pushed into May, it was still at 38% as well. So it was pretty crazy just to see how much of a just our market just like collapsed essentially. And it took, I think, for us 3 weeks would have been really quick. It was at least 6 weeks for us when we had some of the conversations with some of the agents that what's the dialogue with your clients. And it's interesting to hear from you, Ming, that most of your expert or experienced investors were the ones that jumped in. Whereas for us, we found it was more so investors have the idea of, hey, unless there's like a absolutely insane deal, I'm really not moving on anything. I'm more in a wait and see pattern. And when we started to really pick back up, it was kind of like the end of May and June is when more so home buyer type individuals decided, hey, my primary residence isn't big enough for 2 adults working at home with kids and a dog. It's time for us to make a change. And so we found that the investor market, the investor buyer client, selling client ended up just taking a holding pattern where we kind of had to shift a little bit more for, our normal home buyer, traditional type real estate transaction.
Makes sense. Kev, how did it go? Hey, you knew you were next. How'd it go in Vancouver?
Well, again, I have to echo Adrian. We had a very similar timeline. So things, really went on pause in March. And we didn't really understand the full effects in the real estate market up until April. And it wasn't until probably mid-May, beginning of June, where I kind of did this. And I was having a conversation with another realtor, and she had this townhouse out in Langley, and she was just talking about multiple offers and hot market. And so, I'm a very risk averse person, especially when I'm advising my clients. And so, that was the sign that, that Vancouver market was kind of getting back to normal.
Makes sense. Well, that's, I mean, it sounds like, yeah, Edmonton definitely lagged behind the major markets by about a month. Now, I want to talk, let's talk investors, because that's who we are. How did COVID affect the renters, the landlords, the vacancy rates, and what kind of laws got enacted or policies got in place on the landlording front? Let's talk about that situation a little bit.
It was definitely tough for landlords, I will say, in BC. Right around March is when we had the ban against evictions. And so basically tenants were either, not being able to pay or taking advantage of the situation. But landlords were having a lot of anxiety when it comes to their rental properties. And so I was having a conversation with a couple of my investor clients, and they were talking about how they had several rental properties. They wanted to defer some of their mortgage payments, and they couldn't because they had rental properties. And so it was just very tough seeing that line between how, landlords have the benefit of having the rental properties in the long term, but in the short term here, they're really feeling the stress and the pinch, especially if they didn't have that 6 to 12 month reserve fund. And so as the year progressed, we saw a lot of demand decrease for rent. And so now landlords are struggling to fill their vacancies, make their mortgage payments, and it was a super, super stressful time for them.
Totally. Now, how many, obviously we're in the market, we deal with a ton of investor clientele. So, hit me with the word on the street. How many people did you hear about where tenants either just didn't pay rent or deferred rent? How often was that actually happening based on, your conversations with the people we work with?
I would say probably about a third were having issues.
Okay.
Wow.
Probably about a third. I mean, I'd like to think that, most people here in BC are super kind and empathetic and, understanding. And so I was expecting it to be a little bit higher, to be honest with you. I was expecting a lot of renters not to be able to pay, but it also speaks to the tenant profile of a lot of my investors. The properties that I got them into the tenant profile were higher income people that weren't really affected as much in terms of their income being changed. And so I think that also contributed to being a little bit on the lower side.
Interesting. Well, Adrian, let's talk about that same story in Edmonton.
Yeah. That's interesting because it sounds like, it's just, it's interesting. We found I think I had definitely a different approach and thought to it. Well, Alberta being the Wild West of tenant rules and laws, that's why we do see a lot of out of province investors come to Alberta. And so, we were like, no, they're not going to do anything. Conservative government, they're probably just going to say tenants deal with it and don't get yourself into a pickle. But we did see about, I think, the end of April, middle of April, it was that the Alberta government enacted a basically non-eviction for non-payment of rent. So if your tenant didn't pay their rent, you couldn't evict them due to that. Basically, what they said is you as a landlord and you as a tenant come together and figure it out. Get yourself on a payment plan. And that was essentially the process that the government rolled out. And that, went away fairly quickly as things went back to normal. Summertime happened, and I think they removed that in August. But I mean, that didn't really change the demand for some of the cases that landlords were having. And so in Alberta, if you have an issue, you go to the RTDRS, which is the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Services, and you basically file your case, and that was still backed up. And I know on one of our commercial buildings, we have a tenant that has been not paying rent, and I think it's been since September, and they pay partial payments, and we're trying to get them out, and it's taking 6, 8, 12 weeks for the property manager to find or to get a hearing with the RTDRS. So I think for us, it's just that pressure that came from just the system. Even if you had a tenant, that was the problem. That was the issue.
Well, Adrian, I wanna dig a little bit deeper, because our colleagues from Vancouver and Toronto are probably saying, you think 90 days is a ridiculously long time to get a tenant out? When we hear Ming talk about the tenant laws in a moment here, I think we're going to hear a different story. So, Adrian, pre-COVID, what did eviction for non-payment look like? So, for those people tuning in from across the country in Alberta.
Yeah. So basically, if you breach your contract, you can send somebody a 14-day eviction notice. And there's like some stipulations. You have to let them know what they owe. You have to serve it to them in person or post it. You have to try to serve it to them, I think, at least 2 times in person, and on the third you can post it. But essentially it's a 14-day process. And what happens is, if they end up making a payment or completing the overdue expenses, then they can stay in the suite, and it goes back to the normal tenancy period that they have existing. So I guess that's why it's still the Wild Wild West. It's interesting. I'm very curious, Ming, on what your guys' process is in Ontario. It sounds like
I'm gonna hand the torch over. So to summarize, Alberta's experience was we had a 1-month ban on evictions, starting on May 1st, fair game on evictions, and no rental forgiveness, only rental deferral. And the biggest consequence we had is there was such a big backlog of evictions that it took 60 to 90 days to evict instead of 30. That's Alberta. So it sounds like, and we didn't really have that many people missing rent because the laws didn't really give the tenants that much latitude to do it. Whereas, Kevin's saying about a third of tenants ended up being rental problems. So, let's head back over to the further left end of the political spectrum and hear how Toronto did on the tenant end of things.
It's really interesting to hear, because your worst timelines for rental evictions don't even meet our best timelines for rental evictions. It takes, for us to get a hearing at what's called the LTB, the Landlord and Tenant Board, takes at least 4 months right now before your case is even heard, right? And then it can take a month to 2 months after your case is heard. So you're looking at more of a 6-month timeline here, and you could be getting 0 rent during that time period. So the impacts of having a non-paying or poor tenant in an Ontario market with Ontario laws is much, much more severe. So that said, we had the same sort of thing: ban on evictions, and our landlord tenant board shut down during that period. So they weren't listening to anything either. And basically it was, you guys deal with it. If your tenant's not paying, you take your tenant to your lender and you guys work something out with you and the bank. And that's what we had advised our clients. If your tenant isn't paying you and they've lost their job for whatever reason, both of you go to your bank and explain your situation and work on a mortgage deferral because your tenant can't pay. One of the, I would love to say it was from our amazing foresight, but even within Toronto, we're quite niche in that we go after a very, very specific tenant profile. So our tenant profile is pretty much a wealthy millennial. They're knowledge workers. They work in consulting, accounting, those kind of high-paying jobs right in the downtown core of the city. And our client group probably represents 200, 300 odd units within Toronto. But these people are all knowledge workers. They're not in the service industry. So when COVID hit, they basically just worked from home. It didn't change their reality too much. And when we did a poll of our clients on May 1st to see how many people didn't get their May 1st rent, it was only 0.75% of our clients that didn't get rent. And I would say it's not, I wish I could say it was genius, but it was more because we happened to go after knowledge workers. And it was just COVID happened to not hit knowledge workers. It hit people who are more in, service type industry jobs. So we kind of lucked out there.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible. So, I am curious, just from our Alberta perspective, it's like, well, so if it takes a year to get a bad tenant out or 8 months to get a bad tenant out, what the heck are you supposed to do in the meantime?
Yeah, and not much. You end up really suffering if you have a bad tenant. And I've inherited some bad tenants. My worst tenants have always been through acquisitions. I buy a place and I get a bad tenant that comes along with it. But especially in the Toronto market, and I'm sure it's the same in the BC market, your tenant screening process, not just the screening, but buying the right kind of property to attract the right kind of tenant is paramount, right? You just can't afford to get a bad tenant if you're operating in one of these markets.
Jeez. So let's keep talking about tenants. Like, what's we're now, like, what's the rental market look like? How is the rental market looking now that we're ending this 2020 year? And how does winter market, and this is again my Edmonton perspective, but the winter rental market in Edmonton is very seasonal. So I don't know if it's the same in Toronto, but what is the rental market December 2020 look like compared to the last couple of years of rental market?
So it's really interesting because if you read the headlines about Toronto, it's like, oh, rents are down like 20%, 30%, and that's not the reality. I know, James, you and I are, I guess, students of Don Campbell, right? And one of the things that always rings in my head is Don Campbell beating on the point of don't just read the headlines, dig into the data. And so we track our own data, and what we're doing is actually tracking rental prices by postal code throughout Toronto. And what we're seeing is there has been big drops in rent, upwards of 20 and 30%, but it's very focused on just two postal codes. And that's right in the downtown core, right in the financial district, where people were living in 400 square feet, right? And what's happened is those folks, they're working from home and they don't want to live in 400 square feet when they're doing that. So there's no mass exodus from the city. It's more like a mass exodus from one postal code to just one postal code over. Because if I just move 10-minute drive out of the downtown core, the rental prices there have dropped 1-4%, like much more insignificant values. So overall, yes, the city has seen a decrease in rental prices. And if you're a Toronto investor, that is unprecedented, by the way. For the last almost 40 years, we've just seen steady kind of increases, which is due to rent control. It tempers rent increases, right? But yeah, that's more what we're seeing, just this hit in the downtown core, with the rest of the city not so bad.
Wow. Well, and Adrian, let's head back over that way. What's going on in Edmonton?
Yeah. So Edmonton, I mean, as you said, it's a seasonal time. But for us, it's, one of the big things is just making sure that with rentals, like, we haven't seen too much. For me, the decreases weren't astronomical. Obviously, in wintertime, what we're trying to do is incentivize some tenants that come in to get our place rented over the others. So you'll do some incentives, maybe do, depends on what type of market you're advertising in. But for me, what we found was having a vacancy or having a lease end during the COVID times was actually more of a benefit, because we were able to do a lot more screening to the tenants that we had. So for people who were maybe in the service industry, or people who were in jobs that might be affected by, say, a second lockdown or some sort of cut where they weren't an essential service, it gave us that opportunity to say, okay, obviously we had an initial lockdown. What happens if you lose your job? Show me your savings. Do you have a co-applicant that we can add on there? So for us, it was almost an extra barrier for protecting ourselves from having a worse tenant profile and just having somebody that's going to be in there. So for us, it was actually kind of a benefit to go through that process. And for us, we actually added some steps in our way that we vet the tenants. And we just went a little bit more thorough in our investigations of, are these tenants a good fit for this property? As far as like renting things out, it's all about location. So if you are looking in somewhere that has a very high demand, you are fine. So Rebecca and myself, we have some properties in the university area, close to White Avenue, very good districts. Those, we're pretty much 100%, 100% tenanted right now. We have no vacancies at the moment. But when we look at some of our other locations where it can be a little bit more challenging to find tenants, especially in the winter market, we have to get creative. We have to constantly post the ads. We have to get out there. We have to do really good due diligence on what the other competitors are doing. So we just need a good pulse on the market. It's not impossible to find tenants. We're going through that process right now. You just have to be diligent and making sure you follow up. It's kind of like chasing web leads as a realtor. You got to be the first person to call and jump on the opportunity.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Kevin, what's the rental market looking like right now in Vancouver?
So a little bit of like what Ming said, a little bit unprecedented. We're usually have very low vacancy, competitive rent, people foaming at the teeth to get the greatest tenants, and I mean the greatest areas in the city, close to transit. And so we're seeing definitely a softening in terms of the demand for rental units. And so a lot of people are, again, not really unprecedented, but not common that the incentives start coming out. Couple months rent free, luring tenants in. So the properties that were in the best areas with the best tenant profiles were getting snapped up very, very quickly. And the ones where investor just really wanted to get a deal done and just bought a property for the sake of purchasing, those specific properties were the ones that were suffering the most because they had so much more competition out there. Right. Luckily, majority of my investors are in areas where the tenant profile is, again, better jobs, higher income. And so they didn't really feel that stress. The people who, unfortunately didn't purchase properties in the areas that were recommended and just wanted to saw the price tag and wanted to get a deal done were suffering the most.
Got it. That makes sense. Interesting. Yeah, it looks it's cool to see how, even though they're on the opposite ends of the country, Vancouver and Toronto have a lot of similarities, and Edmonton is, the middle child acting a little different. Okay, so we're feeling good. It's August. Everything's kind of life starting just to almost sort of kind of return to normal. And then September's, we're optimistic, and then second wave, second set of lockdowns. We're really almost, in terms of culturally, back to where we were in March, but it definitely feels different. So compare for me, Kevin, what economically, culturally, and just how the market is behaving, how consumers in real estate are behaving during the second lockdown compared to the first lockdown.
I think we in Vancouver have adapted extremely well. I like to call what I do now is COVID style real estate, because everything has that COVID lens, like you said. And so what we saw was really in the market, when COVID happened, it was almost like we pressed a pause button and we waited a couple months and then pressed play. And so that demand for real estate in the spring to summer months really just shifted down, and it carried through to the typically slower winter season. And so it wasn't until November where demand kind of left the greater Vancouver area and started moving further out into the Sunshine Coast, the Gulf Islands. And So by the end of the year here, even though we're still, in a relatively strong market, we are seeing a little bit of that taper down. But I don't think it's going to be a typical transition from the slower winter months to the slower beginning of the year to a really hot spring market.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. So let's switch over to Adrian. Like, what's lockdown number 2 looking like? How's the market behaving? What are we noticing?
Yeah, so since, obviously we talked a little bit about the market compressing, and for Edmonton, we're a very seasonal marketplace. We're a seasonal real estate market. And so usually our busy time is that spring, fall, a little bit into summer, or into summer, a little bit into fall. And because we basically had our spring taken away from us on the real estate side, everything just got pushed into the next months and the next month. And so from our stats, like we're looking our sales year over year, May was about minus 38% from last year. And then it just increasingly got more and more. So 38% in May, we're about 14% year over year on the positive side in June. So that's when things really started to pick up. Then it went from about 13.7%, stayed at about 13 in August, and then September, we were just over 35% year over year. And that just continued. October was about 27%. And same thing with November was another 27%.
Wow.
So it was, as far as like where we become like a seasonal market, fall didn't really happen. It just continued with that market of what we typically see. And I think for Mogul, we had a record, I think we had a record June and July. It was insane. It was super busy. So moving into, the new, the second lockdown, it does feel a little bit different. It feels like we've already done this. We know what the ride's going to be like. It's like if you go on a roller coaster and you're waiting in line, you have no idea what it's going to be like, and you do it, and you're screaming, and then you finish, and you're like, "Hey, let's do it again." And you're not all like jacked up like you were before. And I know James loves the analogy, so I'm going to throw them out there. And that's exactly what it is right now. People are like, okay, cool. Like, so we just have to go look at houses and book an appointment. Sure, I'll bring my mask. Should I bring a glove too? Like maybe some hand sanitizer? What do I need? So people are still making things happen, even though we're in December where it's usually super slow. And talking to the team and having our one-on-ones with the sales staff, it's like you can be as busy as you want to be right now. There are people out there that still want to do deals. They're looking for those opportunities, and especially in Edmonton, you can find those right now. So for us, it hasn't really slowed down from October, November. December's been kind of just doing the same old thing, and so I think just depends on how long this lasts. I think we might see some COVID fatigue and people wanting to get out of their house and just continue shopping.
Yeah, I personally, I kind of made the commitment to myself that I wanted to end the year on a high note, and I'm personally going to do probably 7 or 8 transactions with my clients this month. So there's people that are doing stuff here in Edmonton, which is awesome. Ming, what's round 2 of COVID like in Toronto?
I mean, it's very much a similar story. So I don't want to kind of rehash that. July, August, September, October into November were all, I'd say, 20 to 30% higher year over year. Compared to the previous years, because of all that pent up demand. With spring shut down, it all got pushed into summer and fall, and it's still continuing into winter right now. I'd say the one thing that I'm seeing that I don't know if you guys are also starting to see a little bit of is impact to the white collar market. So there have been a couple of larger layoffs here, things like WestJet laid off about, I think, 2,000-3,000 folks. We've had some tech firms do some layoffs here as well. And it hasn't quite hit, our client base. But that is where I'm starting to be a little cautious of as we go into the new year is kind of that timing for our COVID recovery, like when vaccines and stuff come out, we get back to normal, versus a sustained economic impact. And if we stay in a lockdown or we stay in this kind of muted economic environment for too long, I'm worried about that impact on kind of the white collar part of the world. So yeah, we're just seeing a little bit of that right now.
Right on. Okay, well, I think we're gonna start wrapping up. Like, you guys have offered a ton of insight, and just a great summary of what 2020 was like and how COVID really impacted the market. The last question I'm gonna ask is, let's look forward instead of having some hindsight. Like, what in your expert opinion are the best looking opportunities for investors in your specific marketplace as we round the hip into 2021?
Cool. The big one, I guess I'd say the big two for us here in Toronto, something that, Kevin, you've probably seen a lot of in Vancouver, it's Laneway Housing. So about a year and a half ago, Toronto ratified the bylaws around what you can and cannot build in terms of laneway houses, laneway suites, and allowed for as of right spec builds. That has drastically changed the opportunities for our investors in Toronto market. It's still very new. Toronto only has 7 laneway houses that have been completed under the new bylaws, but we have over 100 that are under construction right now. And this will change the face of the city, and it's going to change, the balance sheet of our investors, especially those that are taking advantage of these kind of properties. So that's really the big one. And then garden suites are kind of the next step to that. Without a dedicated laneway, they're also looking at garden suites as well. But that's really where I think the focus is going to be for 2021.
Nice. Adrian, what are the opportunities we're gunning for in Edmonton in 2021 as we round the corner?
Well, probably what's different from a lot of different spots in Canada as far as investing places is Edmonton is known for cash flow. So we're a cash flow city. That's what a lot of people focus on. So I would say the big things to focus on is really make sure that you're buying a property that cash flows well. The numbers that you're given, the numbers that you're analyzing make sense. So maybe instead of doing something where it's 1 or 2 suites, start looking at triplexes, start looking at duplexes with suites in the basement, because that's going to deleverage you a little bit. Obviously, if you have a 1 townhouse you're renting out, you have a vacancy, that's hitting your bottom line. But if you have a 4-plex and you have 1 vacancy, you're making all your expenses up. You're taking care of business. And your cash flow might not be as much, but it's still there. And then lastly, I would say focus on location. Location is going to be key going through 2021. I think that making sure that you're staying close to some of those infrastructure projects, some of those big things that bring people in. Where do people work? Where are they going to be hanging out? That's going to be super important for 2021 because we don't have a crystal ball. We have no idea what it's going to look like. And last but not least, I would say flipping is going to be pretty interesting. If we talked about those March people the investors, and they said, I don't want to buy that house, they would have pulled the trigger. They had 6 weeks to, they had a couple months to get those projects done with no interference. And they could have had a really, really good opportunity to sell those in the summer market. So I think we're going to see some opportunities come up from some of those mortgage deferrals. So I think just focusing on the locations and focus on cash flow and as an investor.
That's awesome. Adrian, I think there's a question for you in the chat if you want to answer it. But Kevin, what are the interesting opportunities that have come up because of this COVID market that are going to be worth looking at from an investor's perspective in Vancouver as we head into the next year?
So the big thing this year that has stood out to me is that the detached and townhouse markets have been really aggressive, and the condo market hasn't actually performed the same way. And so if I was an investor, I'd be looking to get a really good deal close to Vancouver. Obviously, our play here is when you're in Vancouver, you're going for the long-term play of appreciation. So right now in this lull, if you want to call it a lull, I expect, again, no crystal balls here. I don't want to jinx 2021. You know, throughout 2020, we kept saying, what could be worse? So I don't want to jinx 2021, but if all things stay constant, the vaccines work out well and everyone is good, nothing else major comes up to impact the economy, I think that we're going to have another strong spring and summer market. And so if you can get a great deal on a condo, you can hold on to that, ride the appreciation, or again, same thing like Adrian said, flips will be interesting. It's kind of risky if you're not exactly sure what's going to be coming up next, but we have had a very sustained year of appreciation. And so if you can scoop up a really good condo deal and you can hold on to that for maybe 6 months and ride that wave of appreciation on the flip back end, that'd be a great opportunity for people getting into the market.
Sweet. Love it. Great tips, Kevin. And thanks everybody on the panels. I mean, you guys did fantastic. Great perspectives. I mean, we want to know what's happening in Canada, and the cool thing about being on Zoom is we're a Canada-wide conversation now. So we wanted to add a little bit of more to the conversation than just what we do locally in Edmonton and Vancouver. So thanks Ming. Time zone wise, it's getting pretty late over there, so we appreciate you burning that late night oil to participate in the conversation. Adrian, as always, appreciate it. Kevin, awesome stuff. And you know, one of the comments that I saw pop up in the comments bar is just the importance of diversification, and honestly couldn't agree more. That's why we like to have different markets available, because you know what, if you put all of your you do all of your investing in one market, there are some advantages to it in terms of efficiencies of economies of scale. But as we saw, you know, Toronto, Vancouver is similar, but different enough that there's different opportunities. And then Edmonton, different value proposition altogether, being a cash flow centric market. So, you know, as a savvy investor, I think there is a case to be made for being diversified in what you hold, properties Canada wide, and taking advantage of what really a very, very amazing real estate market Canada wide has to offer. So again, thanks to the panel, and I will hand it off to our wonderful MC, Rebecca.